Well, moving on now, Donald Trump's return to the White House in January has produced a seemingly endless stream of tariff threats. Now, in just this latest chapter, Canada and Switzerland are now among the newest targets. U.S. imports from the two set to face 35% and 39% levies, respectively, if there's no deal reached by the end of the day Friday. For more, I am joined on set now by our foreign affairs editor, Kethevane Gorjestani. Hi, Kethevane. So there are some countries getting higher tariffs, others lower ones. I mean, is there any logic behind who's being targeted and how much?
Well, look, first of all, you have 68 countries plus the European Union that were on the list with those new tariffs. And any country not on that list is being hit with a 10% blanket tariff. Basically, if you simplify, it's 10% mostly for the countries that the U.S. has a trade surplus with. Then you have around 15% for countries or groups like the European Union who either struck a deal or have a relatively moderate trade surplus with the U.S. That's true of Japan or South Korea, for example, who also had deals. And then there's higher tariffs for those with no deal or larger trade deficits for the United States. But trade deficit, which was the original original sin for Donald Trump, is not exactly the only explanation when you look at the different numbers for different countries. In the executive order announcing those new tariffs, Donald Trump mentions that some trading partners have, quote, failed to align with the U.S. on economic and national security matters. And national security matters is pretty broad. For example, Canada that you mentioned going from 25 to 35, supposedly on this question and this issue of fentanyl flow. Donald Trump is not happy about that. But it also seems likely to be a sort of retaliation for the prime minister announcing that he would be recognizing the state of Palestine in September. Mexico, who has the same issue with fentanyl, has gotten a 90-day extension to negotiate. India got 25%, seemingly because it's doing business with the Russians. That's something that Donald Trump tweeted earlier on. Brazil getting 50%. This is likely over what Donald Trump calls a witch hunt for his ally and former Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro. So nothing to do with a trade surplus. And then you have China, for example, that got an extension. They're still negotiating there. And that, despite China sort of ticking all the boxes, they're not necessarily aligned politically or on national security with the U.S. They're doing business with Russia. They have a huge trade surplus with the United States. And yet they are getting away with it, at least for now. And that is likely because it's the one economy that can actually afford to go head to head with the U.S. economy.
So what about these trade deals that you mentioned briefly there? I mean, Donald Trump vowed to obtain 90 deals in 90 days. So where do things stand on that?
Well, it's more like 10 deals in 120 days, at least for now. The UK, of course, was the first one to strike that deal. Then you had the EU, South Korea, Japan, and other Southeast Asian countries, but no deals, for example, with any South American nation, no deals with African nations. But when you see the announcements coming from the White House saying we've struck a deal with the UK, we've struck a deal with the EU, usually coming along with we've owned them, it's actually not so much of a deal rather than a framework for a deal. And let's take, for example, the EU-US deal. The announcement was 15% tariffs. When you look into the details, this is, of course, half of what Donald Trump threatened the European Union with, but it's also seemingly more of a ceiling rather than a blanket 15% because there's still a lot of negotiations to happen on specific goods, so we don't know where things are going to stand. Then there was this idea that the EU agreed to spend $750 billion in American energy over the next 3 years before Donald Trump leaves office. The EU Commission, which Ursula von der Leyen was negotiating for, doesn't have the authority to impose on businesses and countries to actually purchase this type of energy from this country under these circumstances. Same goes for the $600 billion investment that was touted by the White House. Commission, again, doesn't have the authority to impose French businesses, for example, to invest in the United States. And finally, there was this idea of purchasing more military equipment. The commission there saying we didn't write anything. We discussed it, but there's nothing really set in stone. If you look at the deal by the South Koreans, it's seemingly a little bit the same deal. You've got the 15%, the pledge for investment, the pledge for buying U.S. energy. And just today, the trade minister coming back from Washington saying, well, actually, it was simply an oral discussion. There's no written agreement that we've signed with the United States. We still need to negotiate. So it looks more like they're giving Donald Trump the sort of win as a headline. But then when you look into the actual deals, it seems that there's still a long way to go before getting all the details.
Certainly sounds like a lot more is up in the air than you would think based on the commentary from the White House. Kethevane Gorjestani, thank you very much then for that in-depth analysis.